Hello again, everybody, and welcome to a research session on Luftwaffe Airfields in the Normandy area. Now, let me explain exactly what I'm going to do here so you can decide right away if you want to stick around or not. We're starting to get closer now to a release of the Normandy 1944 map at DCS, and in fact, we just had our first screenshot from WAGs of some of the ALGs, Advanced Landing Grounds, to the west of Caen and extending up onto the Côte Peninsula, as well as a German airfield out to the east at Évreux. Now, in addition to that, we're going to have the ability at some point on release, I don't know, but at some point the plan is to give us the ability to place smaller scale airfields on the map of the type that would be applicable and used by the Luftwaffe. A lot of just small scale airfields just to keep everything dispersed. And if I go ahead and activate this layer that I have set up in Google Earth, this is a listing of every Luftwaffe airfield that was used in the Normandy area, that I know of at least, in World War II. So basically what I'm going to do here is go through and figure out which of these would have been in use in 1944. For example, what I'm doing is I'm going field by field. I've already started on Alençon-Nord, so if I zoom in here, we get a good look at the current state of the airfield at least. And then as we go, I'm just making notes here with anything that's pertinent. For example, in late July 44, this one was attacked by some P-51s. They claimed 2 Bf-109s, and then 6 August, according to Luftwaffe records, demolition of the airfield was ordered as soon as the last flying unit departed. So that seems to me to be pretty important information for a mission designer. So once I do finish this up in whatever state that it ends up, after I'm finished with this little recording session, I'm going to make the KMZ file that comes out of this available as well to anybody that wants to have a look. So if you want to stick around, feel free. If not, well, feel free to check out any of the other, whatever it's up to now, 500 or so videos on the channel, or check somebody else out. So I'm going to just jump straight into this. And like I said, I have a lot of resources I'm drawing on here, but primarily I'm doing what any good historian is going to do, and I'm just sort of basing this off of somebody else's very, very good work. This is Luftwaffe Airfields 35 to 45 in France by Henry deZeng. It's updated as of July 2014. This is believe me, this is some very, very good research that this gentleman has done here for us. It goes airfield by airfield, it gives coordinates for everything, so that's how I was able to plot all of this in Google Earth, and then it goes field by field, giving a rundown of the history, and then some, where available, units assigned, and then just important dates in the history of these airfields. So that's exactly what I'm going to do right here, just separate this out and figure out of all these 80 or 90 or 100 airfields in Normandy, which ones are going to be applicable. I started off by going in alphabetical order with Alençon-Nord way down here to the south. Now, I guess that's another note. I have no more insight than anybody else when it comes to the status, when it comes to the plan, the scope of this map. Now, I can't say with certainty that the Caen area, the Allied ALGs and airfields are going to be there for us, so, that's going to take us from June of 44 all the way up until August, and the breakout from Saint-Lô and the breakout from Caen, and then pretty much all the way up to September if the terrain goes as far east as the Seine. And we also saw in a screenshot that WAGs provided that airfield out there at Évreux. So I am hopeful at least that we are going to have the terrain extending at least to the Seine and possibly even up to the northeast corner of Normandy, and that would take us from June all the way up until September. So, this is prime territory for Spitfire Mark 9, and then especially for P-47 operations once that aircraft does finally come along. There is no lack of history to look at, no lack of missions to fly here, but yeah, we'll get into all of that. Well, probably as we go here, I'll start to talk a little bit more background. Now, let me go ahead and instead of going alphabetically, let me just start up here around Caen, and I'll go to the Caen Carpiquet airfield and go to the properties on it. Now let me bring up my resource here, and I'll do some heavy editing here to make this flow a little better, because this is going to take me a long time, but hopefully it won't be too long a video. I'll be right back. Now, Carpiquet, pre-war French Air Force base, completed about 1938, taken over by the Luftwaffe, and we're going to get very familiar with, if not the airfield itself, the area around it. This is going to be just a prime hunting ground for close support missions being flown from the ALGs. The Carpe airfield didn't fall to the Allied forces. It'll actually probably tell me right here until, 9 July 44, a month and a few days extra after the landings themselves. Airfield taken by the 8th Canadian Infantry and made serviceable again as Allied Airfield number B-17. But for our purposes here, we can see 6 June 44, runway demolished by station personnel and the remainder of the infrastructure by 17 June. So this is going to be practically no factor as far as enemy aircraft operating out of there. Although that does sort of contradict a book I was reading. It was, I'm absolutely certain that some reports that I was reading mentioned at some point German activity out of Carpe after the landings. So what I've been doing, or what I plan to do, is if I still need to follow up on something, I'll leave it yellow. So I'm going to leave this one yellow for now and move on to Con Carmel on the other side of the river. Okay, and this one existed pre-war, used by the Luftwaffe June and July of 40, and nothing beyond that. So this is one that I will, in fact, mark as red. And for 1944 purposes, I'm going to forget that one exists. Now, Plumetot to the north of Con, I know this is not going to be active because this one would have been crawling with, let me see, that would have been British right there. It's a little bit east of the Canadian zone, I do believe. And there we go, prepared by the French in 38 and 39, used by the Luftwaffe of 40-41, taken over by the Allies as ALG B-10 and used by RAF fighters. So this is one that we will be familiar with. And let me go ahead and zoom in here. And I think I mentioned earlier that all sign of a lot of these airfields, or most of these airfields, was gone by the early 50s, just reclaimed as farmland, and that's a good example right there. Whereas, for example, this one at Carpe, that's the main airfield right there, and of course, no sign of this one either. But in either case, I'm going to mark this one as red when it comes to Luftwaffe activity, and the same thing will apply up here at Crépin, but I'll look it up anyway. And we have French airstrip used before the German occupation in June of 40, and then Luftwaffe use in the summer and fall of 40, permanently obstructed since 31 July 42 with shallow trenches, poles, and logs across the landing area. And it's possible, I suppose, the Allies moved into that exact location. It doesn't mention it here, but in either case, that's beyond the scope of what I'm worried about here, so I'm going to mark this one red. And I'll move down south to Maltot. And used by the Luftwaffe in 40 and 41, abandoned, turned into a decoy. By 42, part of it had been returned to cultivation and the other part trenched. Replica aircraft parked around the former landing area, fake shed erected on the east corner. I'll leave this one yellow just to see if I can find any records of this being active in 44 as a decoy airfield. But nothing is going to be operating out of there. Let's go for Havre. And I'm going to mark this one red. No records found of Luftwaffe flying units stationed there after the fall of 40. So this one is red. And I'm going to go ahead and, on second thought, also mark Maltot red, because it's close enough to the Allied lines that they would have figured out pretty quickly that this was a decoy. So by the time that we get into air operations on the continent, this, I wouldn't imagine, will be a factor. It's going to stick in the back of my mind, so if I do run into any mention of it, it'll drive me to revisit it. But marking both of these as red, not used for our purposes. And we'll go to the east slightly to Con Roquecourt. And again, no sign of this one lived in the field. And one other thing to note here, and I'm making a note of it also in the descriptions here, you'll see a lot of these are marked as landing grounds. I think the only airfield we've seen so far has been Kappa K. And I'm really using the authors here distinction between the two, but there were German terms that described the difference between an airfield and a landing ground, and it's really just as simple as what type of infrastructure was there. An airfield is going to have repair facilities, it might have hangars. A landing ground is going to be just, exactly what it sounds like, a landing ground. Just a forward basing location that might be built up with temporary style facilities that would allow you to operate out of there, but not like your big built up permanent style facilities. And I think the majority of these are just going to be either grass runways, and like it says here on Roquecourt, no paved runway, possibly equipped with boundary lighting. It gives all these details right here, but the majority of these are going to fall into that landing ground category. And we're also going to run into satellite strips, just basically alternate landing fields that are in close proximity to a larger airfield complex. And then we're going to get into some dispersal fields or fighter strips. And those are really bare bones. Those are the ones that you see the photos of aircraft hidden in trees. That's the type of setup that would be referring to. But we'll see some more examples of that. Now, Rocancourt itself is another Battle of Britain airfield used in the summer or fall of 40 and relapsed into inactivity after the spring of 41. So let me come down to some dates here. And this one is showing no activity that would concern us here, so I'm going to mark this one red. And an overall theme that we're going to start to pick up on here is that, of course, many of these coastal airfields will have been active during the Battle of Britain and into 1941, and then as they started to get pulled to different locations into the Eastern Front, into North Africa, Italy, Sicily, that the north of France really starts to thin out. And then, of course, the Allied combined bomber offensive going after the German aircraft industry itself just doesn't leave any aircraft to backfill, even the major airfields up here in Normandy. So not a lot of activity in 42 and 43. And then, of course, in early 1944, all the active airfields, pretty much from Brittany all the way up to the Netherlands, were just pounded for months to ensure that any landing attempt, whether it be Pas-de-Calais, Normandy, or Brittany, was also a very, very seriously considered option. All these airfields, being within easy reach of England, were just pounded to the point where the Luftwaffe in 1944, at the point that we're going to be picking things up on this map, could almost be considered no factor at all. Just reading through some of the day-to-day accounts from these units, mission by mission, I'm going to have to one of these days go back and try to quantify this. My impression, just using the individual mission reports for a lot of the Spitfire Mark 9 units, even the ones that were just dedicated to going up and doing fighter sweeps, air-to-air, in the time frame that we're looking at, I would say the chances of actually seeing a German aircraft would be, my feeling is it's like 1 in 5 missions, maybe. And again, I would have to go back and quantify that, but this June and July and August 1944 time frame is a very, very bad time to be a Luftwaffe pilot flying from any of these airfields. And just the sheer number of Allied fighters that come across, and then just within days, 27th, 29th of June, I mean, practically all the tactical air that was in Britain and 2nd Tactical Air Force on the RAF side or 9th Air Force on the US side was in place on these ALGs. And then to think that they could move that many men, that many machines, that much equipment, and just go straight in without skipping a beat into operations from these ALGs, that's just mind-blowing. And yeah, in either case, okay, so that wraps up the airfields in the immediate vicinity of Caen. Now, while we were looking at Caen, this is the British sector. So we have, how does it go? Gold, Juno, and Sword Beach. So British and Canadians landing up here and then pushing inland. Some British airborne units landed over here on the other side. And in fact, here's another one that I was going to look at. I could have swore there was also an airfield that was an objective of one of the airborne units coming in on the other side of the Orne River, with the objective being to secure an airfield back here as like an emergency landing strip, an emergency resupply strip. And then, of course, if we zoom in here to Pegasus Bridge, this was one of those hold at all costs locations right here, because there was a whole lot of armor coming up right here on Sword Beach that was intended to come down the river, cross at Pegasus Bridge, and then encircle Caen, allowing the British to immediately just fire right down this gap right here through Falaise and down to Argentan. And you can see that the terrain up here doesn't have the bocage, the hedgerows. And the intent was to get the armor around Caen and down here to cut off the retreat of basically the rest of Normandy, while the Americans came over here at Omaha and Utah Beach, secured Cherbourg, the port up here, as a supply point, and then everybody would just happily roll on around here into France and liberate Paris. In reality, no, it didn't really go that way. Caen held until late July, despite many, many attempts to break out. But even though the British and Canadians didn't manage to break out from Caen, that did tie up a lot of forces and keep all these panzer divisions that were reinforcing up here through this line, Argentan, Falaise, Caen, through this little supply route right here, that did allow the U.S. forces time to take Cherbourg and then eventually slug their way up to St. Lo. This was very, very tough terrain to take. And you can zoom in here and see the bocage. These are those hedgerows that I was talking about. And that made for very, very defensible terrain on the German side. But you know, the other side of that coin is that as difficult as it was to attack into the bocage, it was just as difficult for the Germans to counterattack. And there are a lot of cases up here when we get to the west of St. Lo where very serious attempts were made to either break out from the Cotentin Peninsula down here along the western coast, or to go in and try to relieve them from the south. But, you know, the Germans just sort of ran out of troops at that point. And eventually the line sort of stabilized, running across to St. Lo, Caen, and then Operation Cobra came along in late July, and that was the breakout from St. Lo. So we had the U.S. forces over here to the west breaking out to the south and then turning east, while Third Army and Patton come down here, just make a dash through Brittany, and then do their thing. But up here in the Normandy area, we're going to have the British still up here, just advancing along the coast to the Seine River, and then the U.S. forces that are still in Normandy coming around and encircling German forces that had been trapped in the Falaise pocket. And then from there was just a drive to the Seine, the liberation of Paris. And then, at that point, we're already out of the Normandy area. But like I mentioned before, I mean, this is a good 3 or 4 months of activity here that's going to keep us occupied. This is just, to my way of thinking at least, the ideal. I couldn't be more pleased with getting this area as a first look at World War II and DCS. Now, let me take a break here, since this is a natural stopping point. I got into a lot more background on Normandy than I intended to. At some point, I do intend to go back and do just some straight-up historical videos, breaking down a lot of what I just went over in a lot more detail and a heck of a lot more organized than I just did. But at least now we have some more context, and maybe you see now why I'm looking in the places that I am. So I'll come back next time and pick up with the airfields again, looking at some stuff up around Cherbourg. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.